All right. Welcome everybody to July's webinar for the International Society for Quantitative Ethnography. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I'm here with Brendan Egan co-hosting with me. And today we have Adam Lefstein, who is coming from Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. And Adam is continuing the theme that we set in June with Mike Phillips. We're still at school, but different kind of ethnography going on here. Linguistic ethnography, which may be some new to some of you. Adam is here with his colleagues, Hadar Netz, Eran Hakim, and Aviv Orna, and they will no doubt be diving in at some point, at least during the Q&A, when we get the chance to discuss the work. So without further ado, I want to introduce Adam, who is professor at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and he's going to be talking about a linguistic ethnographic perspective on classroom identities and participation, and some challenges for quantitative ethnography. So Adam, if you can bring your slides up. A reminder that this is being recorded, and of course, will be added to the growing archive of webinars now on the QE SOC site. So over to you, Adam. We're really looking forward to hearing more about this.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me, for having us. And I especially appreciate that it's not 2 in the morning, our time, which probably means it's 2 in the morning somebody else's time. And I appreciate those of you who got up early or stayed up late to be with us. Good afternoon. We're excited to share our work, and we're hopeful that you're going to help us grapple with some problems that we've been struggling with. We have high hopes. Don't disappoint us. Before we begin, just a few words about where we're coming from. As Simon said, we're more on the ethnographic side of quantitative ethnography. My background is in linguistic ethnography. Hadar and Aviv are coming from linguistics. Eran is a sociologist. We're all working in education. We've been collaborating together on a project studying students' social backgrounds and their participation in classroom discourse. We'd also like to acknowledge Julia Snell, who's here and who's contributed quite a lot to the ideas we're going to be presenting. I'm getting a message that I have low system resources, but can you all hear me all right? I'm going to take silence as a yes.
Loud and clear. Loud and clear.
Ah, great. So quantitative ethnography, or to be more exact, epistemic network analysis, ENA, is very well suited to the study of epistemic and cognitive functions of language, namely what concepts people use and how they put their ideas together. And this is great. We really like it. But we want more. Language and discourse and communication perform additional functions, including, for example, identity work, managing relationships, enacting activities, opening channels of communication. Linguistic ethnography offers us a good set of tools for studying these issues, but typically in rather small scale, single or few case studies. Linguistic ethnographic methods are not well suited for investigating systematic patterns across large data sets. And this problem is one of the reasons we're drawn to quantitative ethnography. So here's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to offer a brief introduction to linguistic ethnography and how we're approaching the study of discourse and identity. We'll then apply these ideas in an illustrative analysis of a classroom video clip, which will help set the stage for our current research project about social class, language, and academic performance. We'll share how we're organizing and coding our data in this project and some initial findings. And finally, we'll conclude with some problems that we hope you can help us address in the discussion. We've made the slides and some other materials available. You can download them from the link which appears on this slide. And I've also pasted that link in the chat. Technologically, I can't actually see you all as I speak, which has great advantages. I could just kind of plow on even if you're disconnected. But if you want to grab my attention, then just butt in and say something. I also can't see the chat. And I've timed this out. I could talk for 24 minutes without breathing, but I actually would like to breathe. So if something's unclear or you have comments, feel free to interrupt me, and we have time for that as well. Okay, so assuming you're nodding, I'm moving on. Linguistic ethnography is an umbrella term that describes a growing body of research, primarily in Europe, which brings together linguistic methods for studying language and discourse with ethnographic interpretation of cultural practices. Linguistic ethnography draws upon concepts and methods from multiple traditions in the study of discourse and interaction, including, for example, the ethnography of communication, interactional sociolinguistics, conversational analysis, and social semiotics. In many cases, linguistic ethnographers use these methods to enrich and add rigor to so-called qualitative research in other disciplines. So for example, my work is in education. My research primarily focuses on teacher and student learning through discourse and interaction, rather than language or discourse as objects of investigation in and of themselves. There's some tension between the precise, systematic approach of linguistic analysis and the more open, holistic, and adventurous nature of ethnographic interpretation. This can be a productive tension with, and I'm paraphrasing Ben Rampton here, linguistic methods tying ethnography down, subjecting its interpretations to careful scrutiny, and ethnographic dispositions opening linguistics up in order to situate its work in the social and cultural context in which we use language. Linguistic concepts and methods are useful because the infrastructure of language and communication reflects a high degree of regularity and predictability. And an ethnographic approach is necessitated by the unpredictability of interaction, spaces of particularity, creativity, and agency. Linguistic ethnographic analyses of discourse and interaction are grounded in a number of fundamental insights about social interaction, meaning making, and the communicative order. Here I'm going to highlight three principles. First, meaning is co-constructed in the sequential unfolding of interaction. Rather than viewing meaning as residing within individuals' minds, linguistic ethnographers trace the ways in which meaning emerges in the interactional give and take. As participants display to one another and to the analyst how they're making sense of each other's turns of talk, and then ratify or repair their conversational partners' interpretations. In such a way, meaning is jointly achieved over a series of turns of talk, and therefore can and should be analyzed sequentially by tracing the process of its turn-by-turn co-construction. Contexts are created rather than given. It's commonplace to say that meaning depends on context, but which context? In any given moment, multiple contexts are potentially relevant. I've been doing my utmost in this talk to signal to you all that the most relevant context is that of an academic webinar. I've probably also given off the impression that I'm a bit technologically challenged. But if someone began heckling me, or I started to talk passionately about politics or religion or food, we might very well renegotiate and change our joint definition of the situation. Hence, in analysis, we need to pay close attention to how interlocutors implicitly evoke or explicitly indicate the contexts, roles, and identities that they find most salient. Context needs to be studied rather than assumed. Finally, for purposes of this talk, we do multiple things when we talk. We not only use language to convey ideas, we also, while using language for this referential function, perform a range of social functions. We open lines of communication, we negotiate roles and relationships, we assert identities, we make or extricate ourselves from commitments, we take stances, persuade, entertain, pass the time, and much more. Typically, though not always consciously, we perform many of these and other tasks at once. Hence, analyses of discourse that exclusively focus on its ideational content offer rather narrow views of what participants are doing and what concerns occupy and motivate them. I'm going to share an analysis of classroom identity work, so I should say a few words about how we're thinking about identity. By identity, we mean the way an individual is recognized by themselves and others as a certain kind of person. We view identities as emerging in interactive processes and developing over time, rather than reflecting fixed and stable properties of an individual located deep in their psyche. Stanton Wortham offers a useful framework for studying identities, which traces the way widely circulating cultural and historical identity categories, such as good student or absent-minded professor, are locally adapted in different communities. For example, being a good student is a source of pride in many primary classrooms, but a curse among peers in many middle school classrooms. These categories are attached to individuals and events of social identification, moments of interaction in which we identify ourselves and others either explicitly by describing who we or they are, as I've been doing, for instance, by saying I'm a linguistic ethnographer and Aaron's a sociologist and Adar and Aviv are linguists, or implicitly by talking or acting or being addressed in a certain way. For instance, implicitly, I've been treating you all as people who are coming from a more quantitative background in the way I've been talking about linguistic ethnography. One such event does not necessarily identify someone as a certain kind of person, but if similar events are repeated over time, the identity begins to stick. These processes of social identification have far-reaching implications for students' social lives and for their learning. And finally, to say here that one particularly important identity category, especially for students learning identities as learners in many schools, including the East London Primary School, in which Julia Snell and I conducted our research a little over a decade ago, is the category of the low ability child. Julia and I worked with a group of teachers to promote dialogic pedagogy, a form of teaching that seeks to challenge students to think, to verbalize their ideas, to reason together, and to learn through discussion. Such teaching requires broad pupil participation in cognitively challenging classroom discourse, but these requirements fly in the face of a common ideology of ability as fixed. Indeed, in the working class school in which we conducted our research, whenever we suggested to the teachers to experiment with more dialogic forms of pedagogy, they invariably mentioned their pupils' low cognitive abilities and limited language resources as reasons why such dialogic teaching was not feasible in their classrooms. We look closely at how the teachers manage these competing ideologies in the article listed here. I'm going to briefly introduce you to one episode from that study. The episode takes place in Mr. Robbins' Year 5 classroom. Robbins is a pseudonym, as are all the names of students and teachers in this talk. The class are studying Tennyson's poem, The Highwayman. This poem opens with the line, "The wind was a torrent of darkness." Mr. Robbins asked the class if they think that means it was very windy or just a gentle breeze. Almost everyone raises their hand to indicate that it was very windy. Mr. Robbins then calls on Hugh, who had also raised his hand, asking him which word made him think it was very windy. Hugh was considered to be a very low ability student, and it appears that Mr. Robbins was offering him an opportunity to answer a relatively easy question. However, Hugh does not respond, instead shrugging his shoulders after a rather long 6-second pause. 6 seconds in a classroom, 6 seconds of silence in a classroom is quite a long time. Asha steps in and answers the question, allowing the class to continue. I'm going to let you watch this and then say a bit more about how we make sense of it. You have the transcript here on the slide, which now you have in the handout because I'm moving on to the next slide. So I'm going to tell you what you would have seen and how we're making sense of it. So Mr. Robbins, it appears, suspected that not everyone in the class was familiar with the word torrent. So he checked that they understood the metaphor here. He first read out the line of the poem, then drew their attention to the key word torrent and its meaning, and having basically given them the answer, asked for a show of hands about the meaning of the first line. Most pupils, including Hugh, raised their hands. Mr. Robbins, it seems, seized on an opportunity to let Hugh shine in class by serving up an easy question: which word? He furthermore reminds Hugh which are the candidate words by repeating the line of the poem, "The wind was in darkness," and also repeats the question. Hugh, however, does not cooperate and shrugs his shoulders after a full 6-second wait. A similar dynamic played out on multiple occasions over the course of the year. Mr. Robbins offered Hugh an apparently simple question, which other pupils easily answered and indeed bid to answer, but which Hugh was unable to answer correctly, or in this case at all. Consequently, Hugh was identified publicly in the classroom as a low ability student. Noting, by the way, that Mr. Robbins tries to mitigate the damage caused by this social identification by Hugh's silent shrug, which seemed to us to imply, "I don't know," as "you're not sure." It's interesting also to observe how the rest of the class managed this event. Students are expected and indeed do follow the action in class discussions by orienting their bodies and gaze toward the active speaker. However, once Hugh is called upon, everyone looks away. It seems that they know what's coming and mercifully choose not to bear witness to it. On the other hand, Hugh is left entirely alone to cope with this trial. In another classroom in our study of this school, pupils step in to support a struggling peer and offer him alternative identities to that of the low ability child. The literature on pupil identity suggests that Hugh is not alone. Perceived underachievers are less likely to participate in whole class discussions. When they do participate, they often engage in unproductive interactions, which then identifies them as problematic and/or low ability students, thereby, of course, discouraging them from participating in whole class discussions, and we have this positive feedback loop. But how common is this dynamic? Julie and I observed in our study other classrooms which were characterized by more promising and productive interactions. How common are they? Moreover, perhaps there are lots of perceived low ability children who engage in productive interactions with their teachers, but for precisely that reason, we don't even notice them. We need a more systematic way of studying these phenomena than conducting linguistic ethnographic analyses of those cases that stand out to us. This was one of the motivations underlying our current study, social class, language, and academic performance in the classroom. A second motivation is this. We know that students' socioeconomic status and ethnic background are correlated with their academic achievement. The quantitative sociological research into educational inequality has primarily focused on input-output variables, treating the classroom as a black box. We aim to open this black box to investigate the ideologies and practices whereby students' social background and perceived ability influence their educational experience and achievement. Specifically, we look at variation in students' participation and variation in the instruction that they receive from teachers. We're performing ethnographic participant observation in classrooms, video recording lessons, and using lapel microphones attached to individual students to get a better sense of their perspectives. We're working in schools in a highly diverse Israeli town, serving both middle and lower middle class students, Arabs and Jews, native Israelis and immigrants, boys and girls, and more. Our analysis includes both linguistic ethnographic microanalysis of the type I just demonstrated, but also this analysis does not give us much of a grip on systematic patterns across the data set, so for this reason we're coding and measuring quantitatively the discourse. Since meaning is co-constructed at the sequential unfolding of the discourse, it's problematic to look at an individual teacher or student utterance in isolation. We know that most classroom discourse is composed of three-part exchanges between a teacher and individual student, usually including a teacher initiation, a student response, and teacher follow-up or evaluation, called IRE for initiation, response, and evaluation. We take this IRE exchange as our unit of analysis, coding within each exchange variables regarding teacher initiations, for example, if the teacher posed an open or closed question, how students receive the floor, for example, by raising their hand, being nominated, or interjecting, the extent to which their responses are elaborated and relevant, and the nature of teacher feedback with regard to their participation, the content of their responses, and more. You have, by the way, not the complete coding manual, but most of it translated into English at the end of the slides in that handout I sent you the link for. We hypothesize that students from less privileged backgrounds will be served less cognitively challenging questions, will receive less encouragement to participate, and their responses will be less likely to be incorporated into the unfolding discussion, controlling for the quality of their responses, of course. We also hypothesize that these less productive exchanges will position these students as lower ability, and with time, these problematic identities will come to stick to students. We further hypothesize that the reality will be more complicated and interesting than this rather deterministic story we've begun to construct, and we're particularly interested in probing the inevitable cracks in these patterns. So, here's what our transcribed encoded data look like. Actually, this is not what they look like because they're all in Hebrew. This is a snippet translated into English for this talk. You can see here that we've laid out the transcript according to the three-part initiation response evaluation structure. Each row includes one IRE exchange. It's kind of like a stanza in ENA, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. The teacher's utterances appear in yellow, with each student response highlighted in a different color. The colors, of course, are for your benefit. Having read David's book, I know we should never use color in our coding system. Each of the subsequent columns includes one of the variables. We have variables for student background, for teacher initiations, for student responses, and for teacher follow-up moves. So far, Aviv has coded over 1,000 exchanges in 8 lessons. In what follows, we share some of our initial findings. Okay, so first here we have the distribution of participation by gender. This class includes almost 2/3 boys, who, as you can see, receive on average more than 3 times as many turns of talk than the girls. Note that we haven't performed significance tests on this or any of the other tables in what follows, though here the difference is so pronounced and we're dealing with a data set of over 1,000 observations, so I assume in this case it's also statistically significant. Likewise, there are many more Jewish students than Arab students, and the Jewish students dominate the floor. We should explain here a bit about the Israeli education system, which is for the most part segregated into different subsystems. A secular Jewish subsystem, a modern religious Jewish subsystem, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish subsystem, a few ultra-Orthodox Jewish subsystems, Arab subsystems, which are also separated by religion. The language of instruction in the Jewish schools is Hebrew, and the language of instruction in Arab schools is Arabic. There are a handful of Hebrew-Arabic bilingual schools, but only a handful. The particular school in which we are conducting our study is a secular Jewish school. 3 of the 4 Arab students joined the school in this past year following their previous school's closure. This and their emerging Hebrew language proficiency may explain part of the considerable gap between Jewish and Arab student participation, but likely only a part of it. Bakhtin writes, I'm moving on to teacher elaboration of student responses. Part of the motivation for this is Bakhtin's idea that and I quote, if an answer does not give rise to a new question from itself, it falls out of the dialogue. Many student responses in classroom discourse are precisely like this. They're passed over as the teacher holds out for the answer that she was looking for, or the answer that will help her push the conversation forward. To study this phenomenon, we coded for elaboration moves. These are turns in which the teacher either probes the student to elaborate his or her, usually his in this case, response, or poses an uptake question, that is, a new initiation that incorporates the student's answer. These 2 elaboration moves, probes and uptake, were relatively rare. In 80% of the exchanges, there was no elaboration at all. The teacher more frequently elaborated boys than girls. 4% of boys' responses were taken up in the teacher's next initiation, compared to only 1% of the girls' responses, and 17% of the boys' responses were probed, compared to 12% of the girls' responses. Now looking at teacher elaboration of different types of student response. Whether a student answer is probed or taken up, or alternatively not elaborated at all, is likely dependent on the quality of the student answer. One measure of quality is what we're calling response structure and reasoning, a variable that we've borrowed from Czech researchers Klara Sadova and Roman Safaricek, who of course are building on others who've come before them. This variable distinguishes between a very brief response consisting of a single word or phrase, a sentence, and a sentence with reasoning. For example, Mr. Robbins asked which word or words told us that it was very windy. The response's torrent, or torrent of darkness, would be coded as a word or a phrase. If a student were to say the word torrent means it's very windy, that would be coded as a sentence without reasoning. And if a student were to say, I think it's the word torrent because it reminds me of a torrential storm, which is windy, that would be coded as a sentence with reasoning. And indeed, student reasoning appears to be more often elaborated than words, phrases, and sentences that do not include reasoning. Since we're particularly interested in individual differences in participation and in how the teacher differentiates her teaching for different students, we also conduct analyses at the level of the individual student. Here are the frequencies of different types of responses for 4 different students, and I'll say a few words about each of them. Sean is considered to be a relatively weak student by his teacher. She, the teacher, says that while he speaks a lot and is active in classroom discussions, he talks a lot of nonsense, he lacks independence, he can't cope with academic tasks alone, and, in short, he lacks ability. Naama, the only girl among the 4, is considered to be a good student, not excellent, but good. She's motivated, has potential, works at classroom tasks, and participates in classroom activities. Yarden, according to the teacher, is the smartest kid in the class. He's motivated and responsive, though he suffers from some difficulties related to anxiety. Finally, Nimrod, a Jewish student from an Ethiopian background, is considered to be a very weak student. The teacher thinks he probably has learning disabilities, though he hasn't been diagnosed as such. He is, to quote the teacher, a lovely boy who is somewhat marginalized socially. These assessments are to a certain extent reflected in the data on student responses. Sean's verbosity can be seen in the fact that he took 158 turns at talk out of 1,147, which is about 14%. And Yarden's academic excellence is reflected in his expressing himself in sentences with reasoning at over double the rate of the other students in the class. Here we look at the differences between the different students vis-a-vis the teacher's elaboration of their ideas. We were surprised to find that Yarden, the strongest student in the class, according to his teacher, who engaged most frequently in reasoning, was not elaborated at an appreciably higher rate than the other students. Interestingly, Nimrod, the weakest of the 4, benefited from the highest rate of uptake, though note, of course, we're talking about only 2 occurrences. These are the sort of anomalies that we look forward to investigating more closely through linguistic ethnographic microanalytic methods. So we've got to the concluding part. I don't know if you're still with me. I can't wait to get out of my slides so I can see you all. In concluding, we want to talk about some problems we're struggling with in the sincere hope you can help us think through them. First of all, how can we best make sense of and represent the patterns emerging from our data set? As we demonstrated, we're currently using cross-tabulations to compare the frequencies of different events and of their co-occurrences. This is rather primitive. Ideally, we'd like to be able to model the relationships between numerous variables to be able to say something about, for example, the likelihood of different students' reasoned answers being elaborated when responding to open versus closed questions, and or after having received the floor by teacher nomination or after having taken it by force. We could do this through a logistic regression, but we bet you have better ideas. We'd also like to be able to visualize and communicate those relationships in an accessible way. We're very interested to hear your ideas about how to do justice to this data set. We're also interested to hear what you think about how to best account for the sequential nature of discourse and interaction. The organization by exchange offers us a partial solution to this issue, but what about the relationship between exchanges, or the temporal trajectory of an individual student's participation over the course of a lesson or a year? And what about the drawbacks of organizing the data set by IRE exchange? Does it impose upon the discourse a teacher-led structure that may not always be appropriate? Furthermore, we'd love to hear what you think about how to combine our ethnographic and quantitative perspectives on this data set. And finally, it's a little late to ask, but a little concerned with, is this quantitative ethnography? So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all.
Great. Okay.
And over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Let's have some virtual applause. You can use your reaction button at the bottom there to add some virtual hands up there. Just imagine Wembley Stadium, you know, in uproar, Adam. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. Now, you've asked us some interesting and challenging questions here. This is going to be more of a sort of throw it to the audience for some answers kind of session, it seems. Now, you did have a link for your slides, and I do wonder whether it's worth just pasting that in, and then those who want to can grab the
where did I put
your
it?
Final slide, or maybe we can ask you to put your final slide back up as well, just to remind people of your questions. Now, folks,
Yeah,
if you want to ask a question, you can just type it into the text chat there, or you can put up your virtual hand, and then you'll join the queue. To do that, you need to click the participants button, and that opens up the list of everybody who's here. And then you see the three dots that allows you to stick your blue hand up, and then you will pop up at the top of the queue, and I'll invite you to switch your microphone on. Okay. Adam, did you want to put at least your last slide up, because that was a prompt slide for us? Okay,
I'll try. I put it all on the
oh yeah, okay. The link
on the chat again for people who joined after it was up there the first time. Let me see if I can.
Actually, that's a good solution.
Is that yeah? Because my problem is that when I share my screen, I can't see the rest of you, and it's actually
okay. I think that's
difficult to have a conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, who wants to kick off with a comment or a question? Who's sitting on the solution to Adam's final slide? I'll give you a moment to think. Okay. So, David, do you want to kick off and unmute yourself?
It looks like David wrote the host won't let you him here.
That's okay.
There. I got personally invited to unmute myself. Yeah, so this is a great talk, Adam. I really enjoyed seeing somebody who really has a depth of understanding of qualitative work and how to present qualitative work presented. It's nice to see the kind of microgenetics and then stepping back and kind of presenting the patterns as you're describing them. And my short answer to your question of is this quantitative ethnography is I think a definitive yes. And I think that not just because there's clearly the ethnographic component and because you did some counting, but it's actually because you used a systematic structure, that well-formed data table that you showed us to link the two. And I think in a sense that the fact that they're connected in that way is what makes it QE. So the question I had actually goes back to that data table, and it's following up on something that you had asked yourself. So like that IRE characterization, I know it's extremely common in classrooms, but some of the most interesting things that happen in classrooms are sometimes not actually following that structure. And I guess I'm wondering, like, to what extent are the times when that's not an appropriate structure black swans, or is it, is it happening with some frequency? And if so, how do you think about that in terms of not so much the coding of the data, but the actual organization of that structure that you put on it?
Aviv or Adar, would you want to respond, or do you want me to? No? Could you all not hear me? I was asking if Aviv or Adar want to respond.
I think, is it possible to make it so that people can just unmute themselves, Simon? Because I suspect if we're going to have a discussion, that might be easier than you having to invite people individually to unmute themselves.
Sure. Okay. Everybody can unmute themselves. So feel free to dive in, any of Adam's colleagues.
I'll start off. This is very strange for me because in Hebrew, at least, Aviv has never been shy.
Oh, I'm losing Adam's audio. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Adam.
I'm sorry.
Oh, you come back now.
Yeah, am I back? Okay. I said I'll start off to answer, and if Aviv or Dar want to jump in, they should feel free. Ask a question, and then have I disappeared again?
Oh, you're back again. Yeah, keep going.
Apologize for my internet. A teacher might ask a question and get a whole series of responses from 7 or 8 kids, some of whom are talking at once, some of whom are responding to each other, and so then we have to make a decision about whether are they still responding to the teacher, are they not responding to the teacher. If we think they're responding to the teacher that was a few moves ago, we'll still list the original question as the question they respond to. It's not that rare in this data, in part because we're working with these teachers on trying to promote dialogic pedagogy. It's something which happens. I'd love it if Aviv would say something about how often it happens, because she's done all the coding. No? Okay.
I think she maybe didn't hear you.
Oh, dear.
Okay. Aviv, are you hearing me?
Yes, but I can talk.
Okay. All right.
So that's, that strikes me as kind of problematic, either from a quantitative ethnographic or even just from a linguistic point of view, as to how you handle that situation, right? Because the structure that you're imposing, even just as far as your coding goes, is going to drive a lot of the assumptions about what's going on. From my point of view, there were two ways I would think about handling that, right? One of them is in the structure of the data table itself. So you mentioned, right, for example, tracking which question the student is responding to, even if it's out of time sequence. We could talk more about that if you're interested. The other thing though is that one of my students just developed a version of ENA that tracks order as well as cotemporality. So you can actually see the structure of ground and response. And so you would get some information about that ordering, and depending on what the size of your window was, right, you'll capture more and less of the sequence when you do that. So that might be just a sort of a technological solution, although I suspect that would mean reformatting your data so that it was no longer IRE, but it was IRE, RRR, whatever, whatever the sequence was.
We'd be very interested in looking at that technological.
Well, and you have the advantage that the student who developed it actually speaks English, so there you go.
Okay, Sylvie. Sylvie, did you want to mic? Otherwise, Adam, you can put these questions in the chat, perhaps.
I think Sylvie's on.
The less mics we're using, the better. Simon, do you want to just read the question?
Oh, you're on, Sylvie. Sylvie, we can hear you. That's fine. Why don't you ask?
Okay. Thank you, Adam, for a wonderful presentation. I had two smaller questions, or maybe they're complicated. I'm not sure. You can give a yes or no answer if you want. Are you coding the IREs at all for content, as in what's going on while these exchanges are taking place, like what kind of task or any other way? And the other question is, are you coding the responses more finely or in a more detailed way, depending on, for example, are these responses, do they always necessitate reasoning at the end of the response? For example, you can have a question that only necessitates a one-word answer, and then it wouldn't be the same kind of category in my reasoning right now to expect to have a sentence after it or some kind of reasoning. Is that a level that you're interested in?
Yeah, so in terms of the content, not in this particular study that we have, we're using the same data, looking at it in other ways. And so there's a master's student who's looking at content and shifts in content. It feels like too much. In fact, already what we're doing feels like too much. Content would just explode the possibilities. What kind of task? We're looking at classroom discussion. So it's we're not looking at discourse around other types of tasks, which are sort of already eliminates that whole realm of possibilities, which is incredibly important. That's something that in a study that Julia and I did, we found that actually a really good predictor of the character of the discourse was the activity that was embedded in. In terms of the responses, well, we're coding for the initiation also. So if the teacher asks which character in the book had a stutter, that would be coded as a closed question, and then we would expect to see a one-word or a phrase response. And if we didn't get that, if we got a response with reasoning, then that would be interesting as well. And that's one of the things we want to try to be able to model, places where students sort of challenge the discourse in ways that the teacher wasn't intending.
I can see Julia has her blue hand up. Did you want to jump in on this, Julia?
We can't hear you.
Hi, Julia. Are you? Did you want to talk? You're unmuted, so you should be able to talk. Okay, microphone's not working. All right. Well, feel free to type in the chat then, if you've got something to drop into the conversation. That's a shame. So I was wondering.
Sorry, go on.
Adam, I mean, it's fascinating. Just even in the bit of video that you didn't quite get to show, but we could quite clearly see that you know, the other kids were all looking away, or they had their heads down. And that was a very powerful photo to show the kinds of behaviors that were going on around that moment when the struggling boy was asked the question. And I would have thought that by looking at the co-occurrence of those kinds of behaviors along with certain kinds of questions and so forth, that ENA would be able to show that, you know, there are strong ties between those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of, you know, and what's going on in the talk. But I don't know, what do others have to say about that? I would have thought that would be coming out quite strongly in ENA diagrams, for example.
You're suggesting, Simon, to multimodal behavior and then be able to map that onto what's going on in terms of the identity work. It feels like almost impossible to code for, but maybe I'm just too narrow-minded.
Can you say more about why you think it's impossible?
Well,
or let's use difficult, but
yeah, they're difficult. Nothing's impossible. Our multimodal repertoires are so much more variable. One of the things about why we need linguistic analysis and is because of the ability of language.
Oh dear. Sorry, Adam. Your line's broken up again. Do any of the others in the team want to chip in on this, on the difficulty of trying to code the co-occurrence of those behaviors?
Yes, I'd like to jump in and say a few words. The thing is, as is right now, you've seen a glimpse of our coding system, and it is quite complex. And we didn't even get into anything that has, or hardly anything that has to do with things that are nonverbal. So we do have a little bit of hand raising, but that's about it. Okay, so how would we incorporate into our coding system additional aspects, like the interesting point that students are looking down and not facing towards the child, the student who's speaking, or the teacher. How could this go into a system that is something that we can still manage?
You know, I don't know about manageability. That's always a challenging question. But I mean, the reason I ask in part is that, as Simon said, it's a really powerful moment. But it was only a powerful moment once you pointed at it. So you had showed us the little clip of the video before, and even when you called up the picture, like I didn't, if I'd been in the room, maybe I would have noticed it, but I didn't actually see that the kids had their heads down. And I'm raising the point because, and Adam, you and I have talked about this before, right? But that moment when you're pointing at the video, literally you were circling the picture. right, is that gesture is a code, right? You are encoding the data right there. And so to the extent that as you're watching it, you're noticing things like that, you know, adding, if you add those to the transcript, right? And I know that conversation analytics has all sorts of tools for doing that, although just writing it down is also one, right? I mean, so that moves it from the realm of possible or impossible to, from potentially impossible to possible. And right, it's certainly true that we have lots and lots of physical communication devices, but in your ethnographic story, there's only a limited set of them that you're going to use, because you have to use a limited set. You can't use an infinite number in telling us the story. And so once you've determined which of those things are useful because you point at them, now you have a finite set that you can encode. And now you could, I mean, in theory, right, you can go back to the video and add, you know, encode for that on the video aligned with the transcript. Again, I don't know how difficult that would be given the sort of technical setup and the scale of your data, but that's the way I would approach it from a, you know, from sort of a coding perspective.
Let me see if can you hear me now? Is this
for the
working?
moment.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk quickly before I can't break up again. Reasoning in language is pretty easy to identify, right? There's some keywords that we can say, all right, well, if I say I think, or because of this, or this is my justification, then it's pretty regular. But the multimodal ensembles that we use to communicate are so complicated. When is a kid looking down at the table because he's bored to tears with what's going on, and when he's looking down at the table because he wasn't make eye contact with Hugh, who's being embarrassed? And it's a whole range of things that if in the moment you can kind of see it and say, that's what's going on. But it feels like an almost infinite set of codes, which of course, if it's infinite set, then it's not, you're going to have a hard time then bringing them all together. That's why I thought it might be impossible.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that we're not talking about how we would automate that, because automation of gesture coding, right? Okay, so we're just talking about identifying it. I mean, I guess I have to throw the question back to you then, right? If when you pointed at that video, right, you told us that that they were looking down to avoid talking to Hugh, right? How did you know? I mean, and whatever answer you're going to give me to convince me that you're right, and you don't have to answer it, right? But whatever answer you would give me, presumably is going to be finite. There's Absolutely. A finite number of things that you will have pointed at in order to make that claim, right? Which means that in the data set, which is by definition finite, because you only have a certain amount of data, right? There can only be a finite number of things that you're required to use in order to convince me that that your interpretations are right. Now, it may be a large number, but just empirically, I suspect that it would be a smaller number than you're imagining it would have to be, right? It's conceivable that every one of these instances would use a different set of reasoning, but my guess is it doesn't, because that's generally not the way people make sense of data.
Yeah, I wish Julia's camera and microphone were working, because I'd be able to ask her how much time, because she did the initial analysis on this, how much time she spent on that episode. I'm guessing it's measured in tens of hours. And that's part of, you're absolutely right, it's finite, but we're talking about through an hour-long lesson at the rate that we use to get it. This, yeah, I think she just wrote yes. It's something which is, when we think about a coding scheme, we're thinking about something which you could go through the data at a rate of maybe 4 hours per hour, or 10 hours per hour. The type of analysis we do in the kind of micro ethnographic analysis, it feels to me like it would never be finite. I mean, I would say logically it's finite, but it would take it would be prohibitive.
Okay, I think Sylvie just wanted to jump in on this one. So Sylvie, go for it.
Thank you. I was reminded of the research initiative that E.T. Hall started back in, I don't know, 60s, 70s, and then that kind of paved the way to the field of proxemics. But he had this amazing array of codes that he used to code human behavior and the space that's around humans, not just like the personal space that we all kind of feel, but also the physical space. And so it might be worth it to go back and check his actual code book, because I think that's publicly available. And just to see, you know, what kinds of codes he developed, because that might be useful to you guys.
Okay, interesting point. And just sort of looking to the future, we've been doing some work on classroom proxemics and how one could automatically code that. So we have some papers out which are talking about that now, which I'll share with you guys. But it's fairly kind of future focused, but it's a glimpse of where things might go, where you could pick up multimodal embodied activity and code those events. Of course, that would be tricky in a classroom full of kids, but just to mention that. Now, because Julia's mic isn't working, I just wanted to read out her comment to everybody for the record, just so we have that. She says, picking up on Adam's final two questions on his final slide, and they were, you know, how can we best combine our ethnographic and quantitative perspectives on the data set? And is this quantitative ethnography? All right, those were the two questions. And then she says, and David's comment that the table Adam presented clearly shows the coming together of ethnography and quantitative analysis. I'm wondering where the ethnography is in the table. Is the coding done by someone who has conducted an ethnography on the school, and thus their coding is influenced by ethnographic knowledge? Or could the coding just as easily be done by someone who is listening to a recording of the classroom, but is unfamiliar with the teacher, pupils, social relations, etc.? So a question from Julia to the team then. How much ethnographic knowledge is underpinning your coding is the question. What are your thoughts?
Do any of you all want to answer?
Yeah.
I just make a general comment that this is kind of classic. One of the things, Simon, you and I were corresponding about was how sort of, I think one of the questions you posed was, how is quantitative ethnography seen in your discipline, and in my discipline? And this is kind of a classic case where the minute you bring in quantitative data, and this happened to Julia and me as well in previous studies, the minute you bring in something which isn't ethnography, then your ethnographic bona fides become questioned, and I think justifiably so, because you kind of have to step away from a lot of the ethnographic knowledge to code reliably. The coding was done by someone who's spent a lot of time in the classroom. That's Aviv. Julia wrote, to be clear, I'm not questioning the ethnographic credentials of the project. No, but we've been questioned on this, as you well know. And so the coding was done with a lot of ethnographic knowledge, but when you set up these sort of codes, they have to be at a level of generality that I think probably someone could code just by listening. But the study doesn't end with some tables of cross tabulations, or with a regression analysis, or even with some fancy ENA with directionality and sequentiality coded in. The study, as far as I'm concerned, that's a stage where we get a sense of the overall picture, and then we go start looking at all the different issues that strike us as most interesting. What's going on there with Nimrod, this Ethiopian boy who his ideas are being taken up, even though he's participating very little. Let's go check that out. Let's go try to understand what's happening in those events, and that's where I think the ethnography comes in even more so.
Can I add something, Adam?
Please.
I think that part of it is that the codes themselves have come bottom up. We didn't just take a code system from a different study, but we used codes that we found relevant, that Aviv, after observing the lessons and going through the transcripts, noticed that these codes are the ones that are of interest to us. And as you say about the kids looking down, so we're open to adding new codes that could be interesting for our analysis. So I think that's also part of the ethnography that might go into the table, where we'd like to see in the table itself.
Yeah, if I could just clarify, since my comment seems to have sparked all this. I actually don't think that the ethnography is in the table any more than the quantification is in the table. What's in the table is the quantitative ethnography. It's the linkage between the two. And you know, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I was seeing that in the table, not least of which is the way the table was structured was actually based on particular hypotheses about the discourse. And the table represented a systematic re-representation of the discourse that then made it amenable to quantitative analysis because of that systematic re-representation. And that's the role that the table played. I agree with everything that Adam and Hadar just said, in particular this idea of like that you actually have to close the loop again. It's not a one-way path from ethnography to that table to the quantification, but you should go all the way around. But it's the table that makes that loop possible. It makes the bridge between the two.
Right.
I don't know if that really answers Julia's question, but.
Okay. Brendan, were you wanting to jump in there?
Yeah, I think that this question is a really important one, and something that it keeps me up at night, because I often am consulting with people on their quantitative ethnographic analyses, and I'm usually helping them procedurally use ENA, right? Or maybe Encoder or something like that to automatically code. And I often with my own interpretations of something. So this is kind of similar to what Julia was talking about with someone who has not been in the classroom and doesn't know the teachers and the pupils and the social relationships, right? That's often a space that I'm coming into. And so when I come up with a model or help someone refine a model, my biggest concern is that I'm showing them a pretty picture that is not grounded in any way and doesn't have any meaning to either the participants or that the researchers might see. And so I think that what David was just talking about as a key piece is that you can have different people and different tools come in that can be helpful, whether it's the data table or different coding tools or other types of quantitative tools like the networks and things like that. But I think the key piece is that you need to, at some point, someone has to understand and make meaning with the data that's grounded in it, that has read the data, that has seen the videos, that has been in the classrooms. But that doesn't mean that you can't have other people or parts of the research team who don't have that can still contribute and help bring in other methodologies that can make sure that you're being rigorous in terms of using other tools that can give you different types of leverage and insights that can be helpful. So I think that that's like a really crucial thing that we need to be asking ourselves is like, well, when are we checking? How are we checking someone else bringing in ENA or the coding or something like that? And what ways in which are we ensuring that we have theoretical saturation, that we're thinking about the decisions that we've made? So I think it's a crucial thing. And we just need to be talking about it and saying, how far can someone be removed? And what ways in which are we bringing back the loop? And I think David's point is the table is one unifying link in that potential chain or that cycle, but there might be others that we need to be talking about to feel like we're doing justice and fairness to the data.
It's interesting. It raises questions about reliability. You know, the idea that actually you need to have an ethnographic grounding to do the coding it suggests that you know, you're not going to get a lot of good inter-rater reliability unless all of your judges have spent a lot of time in the classroom. I'm not sure how far that takes you in various journal publications.
I might push back on that though. I think the question is, even if someone you want to make sure that if something is even automated or someone didn't know wasn't grounded, that how they rated the data aligns significantly enough with the person who is grounded. And then the question is, how much do you need to see, right? We do that all the time with automated coding, is to say, how much does a trained human expert who is grounded in the data need to align with what an algorithm is doing, or another rater who, this happens all the time with graduate students or undergraduate students who are asked to come in that might not have as much experience or grounding. And we say, but at what level can they look in and see, I think I'm seeing this pattern, or pick up on some signal that is tightly aligned with what we think is meaningful.
Yeah, Brendan, I'd love if you would, if Simon lets us, because we're sort of at time, but I'd love to, at this session or some other session, I'd love you to tell the story about how you came to believe that automated coding was possible. I'll summarize it in one sentence, but there's a line from a Woody Allen movie where he says, if everybody went into the same restaurant on the same day and ordered blintzes, there'd be chaos, but they don't. And so to some extent, right, I think one of the answers for coding is, in theory, it's possible to construct something that you could only code if you had that deep level of ethnographic understanding of the data. But in practice, it turns out there's a lot of things that don't require that, and maybe many more than we anticipate. Anyway, maybe with Simon's permission, but that's up to Simon.
Go for it. I mean, I think with our technical problems today, we should stretch a little just to make up for that. Brendan, go for it.
So when I first joined David's lab, I'd worked on a master's degree with a different advisor, and I'd done a certain amount of qualitative work. And when I found out that the lab was doing automated coding, pardon my language, but I thought, this is bullshit. Like, how can you use a machine to identify what I'm going to pick up and all the context I'm thinking about, all of the ways of reasoning that I have as a human? This is ridiculous. And so I spent about a month coming up with all these counterexamples of things that I knew, based on my understanding of how the automated coding worked, that the machine would not be able to get. And I was really proud of this list. I think I had like 50 or 60 examples, and I felt really good about this. So then I bring it back, and then David kind of just smiles and said, okay, well, now I want you to go back into the data and look and see how often that happens. And it was less than like 2% of the time. And part of and so then it becomes an empirical question as to how good you can get it. And part of it is, I didn't have the expertise at that time of how to actually use, say, an automated approach to reliably get at stuff. I've also worked a lot on developing statistics to figure out how much do we need to look at to feel confident in these things. And I always maintain, that's always in the back of my head, this kind of that's bullshit concern or kind of skepticism. And I think it's healthy for me. I always go, it brings me back, but I think it's something that when we're working on this stuff is always baked in, is to double check. It's one of the reasons we've upped our IRR thresholds, and we've worked so hard to kind of come up with tools that hopefully can be one piece of evidence that speaks to the validity of an approach and the reliability of the approach.
So one direction this work could go in is if some text analytics could be developed that would pick up some of the key kinds of moves that you're interested in studying. I mean, Adam, I dropped you a note about text analytics to pick up exploratory talk in Neil Mercer's terms. There may be other approaches that could be developed. I have no idea how mature they are at the moment for your work, but if one was able to code a certain percentage of the significant things you're interested in automatically, then of course the quantitative dimensions open up new possibilities. And I loved when you were introducing us to linguistic ethnography, the linguistics were to try and tie ethnography down, which was quite an interesting expression, because it sounds like ethnography sometimes is perceived by non-ethnographers as perhaps rather slippery, hard to pin down, so much interpretation going on, but the ethnography was to open the linguistics up. Now we're talking about potentially tying down the linguistics computationally. So there's a second degree of tying down going on, which will of course trigger suspicion and derision from certain quarters. But for those of us who are fascinated by the possibilities, then, you know, it allows the quantitative analysis to further tie down the ethnographic study and ground it more rigorously by being able to point to the pervasiveness of this in a large data set, for example, that just isn't practical for you to do manually.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity just to say that whoever is working on getting Encoder to work in Hebrew, we're anxious to have that.
It's the same student.
Because no, yes, I know. I wish use every opportunity to pass the message on. We'd be very keen to. I was very impressed with Encoder. I still think though there's a kind of a principle. I completely agree with you that one of the things I liked about Encoder, I thought Encoder was training me, not I wasn't training the computer. It was training me to make explicit my own sort of reasoning, which I thought was it was an incredible experience, and I just played around with it for that one workshop. But I do think that we make trade-offs when we set a high standard for reliability, and we are going to lose. It may be that those 50 instances you wrote down were only 2% of your data, but they may be the most interesting 2%. So I think I wouldn't want to say that whatever we can't get reliability for, we won't look at, because anyway, I think the point's clear, and you obviously agree with it. So
it actually raises a really good. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted. I'm aware of the time that I keep talking, and people on my team haven't said anything. So, if anyone wants to jump in, this is your last opportunity, I fear.
Yeah, I was just going to very quickly say, I think that actually the point you just made raises a huge and really interesting and important line of research. So we spend a lot of time in terms of IRR thinking about what the agreement is between raters, and we just actually finished a paper talking about how should that work and what do the warrants actually look like. But as far as I know, there hasn't been an effort to come up with a way of systematically figuring out whether or not the disagreements, the uncertainties, are systematically, or even just not systematically, hiding things that we particularly care about in the data, right? We know how. Brandon's figured out a way to determine whether or not your IRR is causing problems in terms of your statistics on the other end, but we don't really have a good way of saying that the particular places in which we're agreeing are problematic, as opposed to just saying how much of them there is. And I think that would be, that's the flip side to my challenge to you, is like, how often does this happen, is to be able to say, okay, well, let's find a way of figuring out how often the inaccuracies actually matter. Okay, so we should probably wrap up there, folks. Let's just have another round of applause for Adam and the team, but for you all as well. We've all been working hard today.
Thank you all very, very much. I'm sorry for the technological problems, but it's great to see you all, and thank you for your comments. And if you have more ideas, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
This will, of course, be up for replay, so you can point your colleagues to it. And of course, do send suggestions to Adam if this has triggered some new thoughts. That's what these webinars are all about. Okay, so just before we wrap up, then next webinar is on the 6th of August. And we've got one of the keynote speakers from the first Quantitative Ethnography Conference, Gol Aristopur Ergens. Tune in for her. But until then, thanks everybody, and look after yourselves.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.